I used to take down enemies with just a piece of rope. Now I'm getting fined by the HOA for a potted plant. Life's funny that way. They see a quiet man trimming hedges and minding his own business. What they don't see is what happens when you push that man too far, especially when you target the one person you'd do anything to protect. This isn't just another HOA dispute, it's a reckoning. And it starts with a single knock at the door. Stick around. You're listening to a drama story from QA Stories. My name is David Peterson, and if you think retirement means peace and quiet, well, you've obviously never lived in a homeowners association community run by a power-hungry madman. This is the story of how my quiet suburban life turned into a battlefield, and how I had to dust off skills I thought I'd left behind forever. It all started with what seemed like innocent harassment, but trust me, there was nothing innocent about what was coming. Elena and I moved to Willowbrook subdivision 3 years ago, thinking we'd found our little slice of paradise. The houses were beautiful, the streets were clean, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough. Elena, my wife of 18 years, is an architect with an eye for design that never ceases to amaze me. She transformed our backyard into something that belonged in a magazine, complete with terraced flower beds, a small fountain she designed herself, and carefully planned lighting that made everything look magical at night. I handled the more practical aspects, the stuff that required getting your hands dirty. People always commented on how precise my landscaping was, how every edge was perfectly trimmed and every plant seemed to know exactly where it belonged. They had no idea that this kind of precision was beaten into me during 20 years of military service, where attention to detail could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Everything changed 6 months ago when Richard Harrison got elected as the new HOA president. The previous president had been a retired teacher who mostly just made sure people kept their lawns mowed and didn't park boats in their driveways. Richard was different from day one. He was a man in his mid-50s with the kind of bearing that screamed former military, but there was something off about him, something that set my teeth on edge every time I saw him. He wore his authority like an ill-fitting uniform, constantly reminding everyone that he was in charge now, and things were going to be different. During his first community meeting, he announced new regulations that seemed designed more to harass residents than actually improve the neighborhood. Grass couldn't exceed 2.5 inches. Door colors had to be approved by a committee he personally chaired. Even the placement of flower pots was suddenly subject to his approval. The harassment started small, almost petty. Our first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, neatly typed and official-looking. Grass exceeds regulation height of 2.5 inches, it read, along with a fine of $200. Elena was furious, measuring our lawn with a ruler and finding that at its highest point the grass was maybe 3 inches tall. I paid the fine without complaint, which seemed to annoy her even more than the violation itself. 2 weeks later, another notice arrived. This time it was our front door, which apparently violated community standards because the color was too vibrant for the neighborhood aesthetic. The door had been the same shade of deep blue for 3 years, but suddenly it was a problem worthy of a $350 fine. Elena started keeping detailed notes of everything that seemed suspicious, which turned out to be quite a lot. She noticed Carol Jenkins, Richard's newly appointed assistant, taking pictures of our house from across the street at odd hours. Carol was a woman in her 50s who'd lived in the neighborhood for years, but had never shown much interest in community affairs until Richard came along. Elena also spotted a camera that hadn't been there before, mounted on a utility pole and pointed directly at our property. When she called the utility company to ask about it, they claimed no knowledge of any new equipment in our area. That's when I started taking things more seriously, because illegal surveillance was a line that shouldn't be crossed in a civilized society. I began installing my own security system, though I was careful to make it look like standard home security equipment. The cameras I chose were high-definition models with night vision capabilities, positioned to cover every angle of our property and several others besides. Elena caught me working in the garage late one night, soldering connections and testing camera feeds on a laptop that definitely wasn't standard consumer equipment. She asked what I was doing and I told her I was just being cautious. She didn't press for details, but I could see the questions in her eyes. That's when she spotted the old photo I'd thought I'd put away safely. A picture of me in desert camouflage standing next to a sign that read Special Forces Operations Base. She didn't say anything about it, but I saw her looking at me differently after that, like she was seeing me for the first time. Richard's behavior around me was strange from the beginning, and it took me a while to put my finger on what was bothering me about it. He would stare at me during neighborhood encounters, not with the casual dislike of someone trying to assert authority, but with the intensity of someone trying to remember something important. During one particularly awkward encounter at the mailbox, he asked me if I'd ever served overseas, and when I gave him a non-committal answer, his expression became even more focused. Carol reported back to him constantly, and I'd started noticing her taking pictures whenever I was working in the yard. She seemed particularly interested in my arms, which made sense when I realized she'd probably caught a glimpse of the tattoo I usually kept covered. The seal trident was small and faded, but distinctive enough that someone with the right knowledge would recognize it immediately. By the 4th week of harassment, the fines had escalated to $750 for what Richard's committee deemed excessive garden decoration disrupting neighborhood harmony. Elena was reaching her breaking point, and honestly, so was I. But something told me that direct confrontation wasn't the right approach yet. Richard was testing me, probing for weaknesses, and I had the distinct feeling that he knew more about me than he was letting on. That night, as I organized the growing stack of violation notices in my old military footlocker, Elena watched me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "David," she said quietly, "there's something you're not telling me about all this, isn't there?" I looked at her, this woman who'd stood by me through 20 years of marriage without ever asking too many questions about the nightmares, or the scars, or the reason I sometimes woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. What is Richard really after? And why does he keep staring at David like he's seen a ghost from his past? Have you ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA president? Drop a comment and tell me your craziest HOA story. I read every single one, and some of these are absolutely wild. I thought I left the battlefield behind. Turns out it followed me home. The escalation happened faster than I'd expected, which should have been my first warning that this wasn't standard HOA overreach. Richard Harrison wasn't just some petty tyrant drunk on his tiny bit of power. He was planning something, and Elena and I were about to find out exactly what that was. The signs were all there if you knew how to read them. And unfortunately for Richard, I'd spent 2 decades learning to read situations that most people never even imagined. What happened next would change everything, and force me to become someone I'd hoped never to be again. Elena's investigation skills turned out to be surprisingly good for an architect. She discovered that the camera pointing at our house wasn't just suspicious, it was completely illegal. The utility company had no record of it, the city planning office had no permits on file, and when she traced the cable, it led to a small recording device hidden in Carol's backyard shed. More importantly, she realized that Richard had been studying my schedule with military precision. He knew exactly when I left for my consulting work downtown, he knew which days Elena worked from home, and he'd somehow gotten access to my calendar through methods I was still trying to figure out. This level of surveillance went far beyond petty HOA harassment and into the realm of stalking. Elena brought me printouts of everything she'd documented, and I had to admit I was impressed by her thoroughness. "David," she said, spreading the papers across our kitchen table, "this isn't random. He's planning something specific, and he's waiting for the right moment to do it." Richard's next move was to hire what he called HOA enforcement officers, 2 men named Max and Jake, who looked like they'd stepped out of a low-budget action movie. They were both in their 30s, built like they spent more time in the gym than thinking, and they had the kind of aggressive energy that made smart people cross the street. Elena and I watched from our kitchen window as Richard introduced them to Carol, pointing in the direction of our house while he talked. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, and all 3 of them looked our way multiple times. That's when I knew we'd moved past harassment and into something much more serious. I'd seen men like Max and Jake before, usually working for people who preferred to solve problems with intimidation rather than legal processes. They weren't there to write violation notices. The harassment became personal and vicious almost overnight. Dead plants appeared on our doorstep, arranged to look like a message. Elena's car was keyed while she was grocery shopping, long scratches that spelled out words I won't repeat. Someone dumped garbage on our lawn in the middle of the night, and when Elena called the police, they said it was probably just kids playing pranks, but I knew better. I'd seen psychological warfare before, and this was a textbook campaign designed to make us feel unsafe in our own home. Elena was getting scared, really scared, and that made me angrier than any amount of property damage could have. She'd started looking over her shoulder when she walked to her car, and she'd asked me twice if I thought we should consider moving. The worst part was that I could see Richard watching from his window whenever these incidents happened, like he was conducting an orchestra of misery. I made a decision that Tuesday morning that I should have made weeks earlier. I called in sick to my consulting job and told Elena I needed to run errands. Instead, I spent the day conducting surveillance on Richard and his operation. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. Richard wasn't just tracking my schedule, he was coordinating with someone else, someone who provided him with detailed information about my daily routine. I watched him meet with a man I didn't recognize, a nervous-looking guy in an expensive suit, who handed Richard a folder thick with documents. They talked for nearly an hour in Richard's car, and while I couldn't hear what they were saying, their body language told me everything I needed to know. This was a planned operation, not random harassment, and Elena and I were the specific targets. The attack came on a Thursday morning, when I had a mandatory meeting with my consulting firm downtown. Elena was working from home, which meant she'd be alone in the house for at least 4 hours. I should have stayed home, should have trusted my instincts that something was wrong, but the meeting had been scheduled for weeks, and my boss had made it clear that attendance wasn't optional. I kissed Elena goodbye and told her to call me if anything seemed off, but even as I drove away, I had a sick feeling in my stomach that I was making a terrible mistake. My phone buzzed with a text from her around 10:30. Carol and 2 big guys at the door claiming emergency inspection. What should I do? I was already turning around before I'd finished reading, but I was 20 minutes away in downtown traffic, and 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Through the camera feeds on my phone, I watched the whole thing unfold with a clarity that made my blood turn to ice. Carol arrived first, carrying an official-looking clipboard and accompanied by Max and Jake, who looked like they'd dressed up for the occasion in cheap security uniforms. They claimed there had been an anonymous tip about dangerous materials being stored in our garage, and they had the right to conduct an emergency inspection for the safety of the community. Elena, being the law-abiding citizen she'd always been, let them in, despite her obvious discomfort. That was her first mistake, and it was one I should have prepared her for. The second she stepped aside to let them through the door, I knew this was going to be bad. I pushed my car as hard as I dared through downtown traffic, running red lights and taking risks that would have gotten me arrested under normal circumstances. The destruction was systematic and thorough, designed to cause maximum psychological damage rather than just property loss. They smashed Elena's handmade pottery collection first, the pieces she'd spent months creating during her ceramics classes. They tore up family photos, including the ones from our wedding that Elena kept on the mantelpiece. They destroyed my military commendations, which had been framed and hanging in my office, grinding the glass into the carpet with their boots. But the worst part was what they did to Elena's garden. They ripped up the flowers she'd planted by hand, smashed the fountain she'd designed herself, and used a baseball bat to destroy the decorative lighting that had taken us weeks to install. I could see Elena crying through the camera feeds, begging them to stop, but they just laughed and kept destroying everything we'd built together. The physical assault began when Elena tried to call the police. Max grabbed her phone and threw it against the wall, and when she tried to pick up the pieces, Jake pushed her hard enough to send her stumbling backward into the kitchen counter. "Lady, when are you going to stop being so stubborn?" Max shouted, his face inches from hers. "Nobody wants you here. Sell this dump and get out before things get really ugly." They cornered her against the refrigerator, using their size and aggression to terrify her in a way that made me see red. Jake grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her, hard enough to snap her head back and forth, while Carol filmed the whole thing on her phone with obvious enjoyment. "This is what happens to people who don't follow the rules," Carol said, her voice filled with sick satisfaction. "Maybe next time you'll listen when the HOA tries to help you understand how things work around here." I made the 20-minute drive in 12 minutes, and by the time I pulled into our driveway, I was operating on pure adrenaline and 20 years of training that I'd hoped never to use again. The front door was hanging open, and I could hear Elena sobbing from inside the house. Max and Jake were still in our living room, admiring their handiwork and discussing whether they should break anything else. Carol was still filming, apparently planning to show Richard exactly how thorough they'd been. They didn't hear me come in, which was their first mistake. Their second mistake was turning their backs on the front door. Their third mistake was thinking that a quiet suburban homeowner wouldn't know how to fight back. I moved through our destroyed living room like a ghost, and by the time they realized I was there, it was already too late for 2 of them. I hit Max first, a precise strike to the pressure point behind his left knee that dropped him like a sack of cement. He went down hard and stayed down, clutching his leg and making sounds that weren't quite screams but weren't quiet either. Jake turned toward me with his fists already raised, but he was broadcasting his intentions like a neon sign, and I'd been reading body language since before he learned to walk. I caught his right hook with my left hand and delivered a perfect uppercut to his jaw with my right, putting exactly enough force behind it to shut down his nervous system without causing permanent damage. He folded like a lawn chair and hit the floor next to his partner. Carol dropped her phone and stood there with her mouth hanging open, finally understanding that she'd gotten involved in something way above her pay grade. I used the garden hose to secure both men with knots they wouldn't be getting out of anytime soon, then turned my attention to Elena. She was shaking and crying, but when I asked if she was hurt, she managed to tell me she was okay. I helped her sit down on our couch, which was about the only piece of furniture that hadn't been destroyed, and held her until the shaking stopped. "Are you hurt?" I asked again, checking her for injuries with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "No," she whispered. "But David, what just happened? Who are those people and how did you do that?" I looked down at Max and Jake, who were still unconscious but breathing normally, then at Carol, who was pressed against the wall like she was trying to disappear into it. "Those people," I said, my voice calm despite the rage burning in my chest, "just made the mistake of attacking my family, and now I'm going to teach them why the people I used to work with called me Vulture." What did David mean by vulture, and just how dangerous is this quiet gardener about to become? If someone attacked your family in your own home, how far would you go to protect them? Let me know in the comments. This story is just getting started. In 20 years as a Navy SEAL, I learned one thing. The most dangerous enemy is one who used to be your teammate. The investigation that Elena and I conducted over the next few days revealed something that chilled me to the bone and explained everything about Richard Harrison's obsession with destroying our lives. But before I get to that revelation, I need to tell you about the confrontation that changed everything. The moment when I stopped being David Peterson, the quiet retiree, and became someone I'd hoped never to be again. The truth about my past was about to come out in the most dramatic way possible, and Richard Harrison was about to learn that some sleeping dogs should never be awakened. Elena's research skills, combined with my knowledge of how to dig into military records, painted a picture that was both shocking and completely logical. Richard Harrison had indeed served in the military, but his discharge hadn't been honorable, and the circumstances surrounding his departure were the kind that got buried in classified files. We found references to a court-martial proceeding, mentions of conduct unbecoming an officer, and several redacted documents that mentioned breach of trust and endangering fellow service members. The timeline matched perfectly with a mission I remembered all too well, one that had gone sideways in the worst possible way. Elena spread the documents across our kitchen table, her face pale as she began to understand what we were looking at. "David," she said quietly, "this isn't coincidence, is it? He knows exactly who you are." I stared at Richard's discharge papers, feeling a familiar weight settle in my chest that I hadn't felt since I'd left the service. Our elderly neighbor, a kind man who'd lived in Willowbrook for decades, provided the final piece of the puzzle without even realizing it. He stopped by to check on Elena after hearing about the break-in, and during our conversation, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "You know," he said, sipping the coffee Elena had offered him, "Richard mentioned something strange when he first moved here. He said he was looking forward to a fresh start, but that he had an old score to settle with some special forces guy who'd ruined his career. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now that I see what's been happening to you folks, well, it makes a person wonder." Elena and I exchanged glances that confirmed what we both already knew. This wasn't random harassment, it was personal revenge, planned and executed by someone who'd been waiting years for the opportunity. The final confirmation came from Carol herself, who we discovered had been documenting everything for Richard with obsessive detail. Elena, using skills I didn't know she possessed, managed to intercept one of Carol's reports through a neighbor who'd grown tired of the harassment campaign. The report included photos of my tattoos taken with a telephoto lens, detailed observations of my daily routine, and speculation about my military background that was accurate enough to make me nervous. But the most damning evidence was a recorded conversation between Carol and Richard, where he explicitly stated that he'd been tracking David Vulture Peterson for years, waiting for the right opportunity to destroy my life the way he believed I'd destroyed his. Hearing my old call sign spoken out loud after all these years was like being punched in the stomach, but it also confirmed that this had to end, now, before Elena got hurt worse than she already had been. I made the decision to confront Richard directly, but I wanted to do it in front of witnesses who could see exactly what kind of man they'd elected to run their community. The monthly HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I knew Richard would be there, presenting his latest proposals for neighborhood improvements. Elena wanted to come with me, but I convinced her to stay home where she'd be safe. This was going to be a conversation between Richard and me, and I didn't want her anywhere near the blast radius when everything came out. I spent 2 days preparing for the confrontation, gathering evidence, organizing documentation, and setting up the presentation that would expose Richard for what he really was. I also made sure to wear a shirt with sleeves that could be rolled up easily, because I had a feeling I was going to need to show more than just documentation to convince people of who I really was. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a bland building that had seen better days but served its purpose for neighborhood gatherings. About 20 homeowners were present, along with the 5-member board that Richard controlled with an iron fist. He was in the middle of presenting a proposal for new security measures when I walked in, carrying a laptop and a small projector that I'd borrowed from Elena's architectural firm. The room fell silent as I set up my equipment without asking permission, and Richard's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized what was about to happen. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice artificially calm, "this is a closed board meeting. If you have concerns, you can submit them in writing through proper channels." I finished connecting the projector cable and looked up at him with a smile that I'd learned in some very dark places. "Oh, Richard," I said, "I think what I have to show everyone is worth making an exception for proper channels." The video quality was crystal clear, high-definition footage that captured every detail of the attack on Elena with courtroom-quality clarity. The room watched in horrified silence as Max and Jake destroyed our home, assaulted my wife, and terrorized her while Carol filmed the whole thing with obvious enjoyment. You could hear a pin drop as the footage played, and I watched the faces of the board members and homeowners as they realized what their elected president had orchestrated. When the video ended, Richard tried to speak, but I held up my hand and kept talking. That was my wife being assaulted in our own home by men that Richard Harrison hired to intimidate us into leaving the neighborhood. What you just watched was a felony assault, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit terroristic threatening. But before we talk about legal consequences, I think everyone deserves to know exactly who they elected to run their community. I had planned this moment carefully, knowing that it would be the point of no return for both Richard and myself. I rolled up my right sleeve, slowly, deliberately, giving everyone in the room time to see what I was revealing. The Navy SEAL trident tattoo was small but unmistakable, a black and gold design that told anyone with military knowledge exactly what kind of training I'd received. The scars were more difficult to explain away. Thick lines of scar tissue that spoke of wounds received in places where medical care wasn't always immediately available. The room was dead silent as I let them process what they were seeing, and I could see understanding dawn on several faces as they began to connect the dots. "I served 20 years in the United States Navy SEALs," I said, my voice carrying the authority that came from 2 decades of command experience. "My call sign was Vulture, and I specialized in counterterrorism operations in places most of you have never heard of. I've hunted some of the most dangerous people on Earth, and I've never failed to complete a mission." Richard's face had gone completely white, and his hands were shaking as he gripped the podium in front of him. I could see recognition in his eyes now, the moment when he realized that his careful planning had led him into a confrontation with someone who was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. But before he could speak, Carol made the decision that would end his career and probably save her own skin. She stood up from her seat in the back of the room, her voice shaking with fear and what might have been relief. "Stop lying, Richard," she shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You told me you knew exactly who he was from the very beginning. You said this was payback for something that happened overseas, and you made me help you plan everything." The room erupted in shocked murmurs and angry voices as the full scope of Richard's deception became clear. I let the chaos continue for a few moments, then raised my voice just enough to command attention without shouting. "Richard Harrison was dishonorably discharged from the United States Army 15 years ago for betraying his fellow soldiers," I said, and my words cut through the noise like a knife. "He sold classified information to enemy forces, resulting in the deaths of 2 American servicemen and the near destruction of our entire unit. I was the one who discovered his betrayal and reported it to command, which led to his court-martial and discharge. Everything that's happened to my wife and me over the past 6 months has been his attempt at revenge for the consequences of his own actions." The room fell silent again, and I could see the pieces falling into place in everyone's minds as they realized they'd been manipulated by a traitor who'd been using their community as his personal weapon. My demands were simple and non-negotiable, and I presented them with the same calm authority I'd once used to brief missions that involved life and death decisions. Richard would resign immediately and permanently from any position of authority in the community. He would issue a public apology to Elena and to every resident who'd been harassed under his leadership. He would make full restitution for all damages caused by his harassment campaign, including the destruction of our home and the emotional trauma inflicted on my wife. And he would submit to a full investigation by law enforcement, because what he'd done went far beyond HOA disputes and into the realm of federal crimes. "You have 24 hours to comply with these demands," I said, looking directly into his eyes and letting him see exactly who he was dealing with. "This is the only time I'll offer you the opportunity to handle this through civilized channels. I strongly recommend you take it." Richard tried to speak, tried to deny or minimize or deflect, but his voice came out as a croak that carried no authority whatsoever. The man who terrorized our neighborhood for months had been reduced to a trembling shell of himself, faced with the reality of consequences for actions he'd thought would go unpunished. Elena appeared in the doorway of the community center, having decided that she needed to be there for the conclusion of this confrontation. She walked to my side with her head held high, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and strong. "I think it's time everyone in this community knew the whole truth about what's been happening here," she said, looking around the room at faces that were still processing everything they'd learned. "And I think it's time we talked about what kind of leadership we really want for our neighborhood. What is the real history between David and Richard, and why is Richard so terrified of a man he supposedly just met? The truth about their past is about to blow your mind. If you're loving this story, smash that subscribe button for more incredible tales here on Stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next." There are two types of enemies, suspicious ones and desperate ones. The desperate ones are much more dangerous. Over the next 48 hours, Elena and I would uncover the full scope of Richard Harrison's betrayal, and Richard would make increasingly desperate attempts to destroy us before the truth could come out completely. What we discovered about our shared past was worse than I'd initially suspected, and Richard's final gambit would force me to use skills I'd hoped never to need again. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook was about to become a battlefield, and this time there would be no rules of engagement to protect anyone. The classified files that Elena and I managed to access through my old military contacts painted a picture of betrayal that was both more personal and more devastating than I'd initially realized. 15 years ago, First Lieutenant Richard Harrison had been my commanding officer during a covert operation in Afghanistan, a mission that was supposed to be routine intelligence gathering, but turned into a nightmare when our patrol routes were sold to Taliban forces for $50,000 in cash. The ambush had been perfectly planned, striking us at our most vulnerable point during a routine sweep of a village that our intelligence said was clear of enemy forces. 2 of my teammates died in that ambush, good men with families back home who trusted Richard to keep them safe. 3 others were wounded, including myself, and we spent 18 hours trapped in hostile territory because the extraction routes Richard had provided were also compromised. I'd suspected treachery at the time, but proving it had taken months of careful investigation and the kind of patience that hunting dangerous prey had taught me. Elena read through the declassified portions of the court-martial transcript with growing horror, and I watched her face change as she began to understand the scope of what Richard had done. "David," she said quietly, "he didn't just betray the mission, he betrayed you personally. These documents say you were the one who figured out what he was doing, and you were the one who gathered the evidence that convicted him." She was right, of course. I'd spent weeks after the ambush analyzing patrol patterns, radio communications, and financial records until I'd built an ironclad case against Richard. The evidence had been overwhelming. Wire transfers to offshore accounts, encrypted communications with known enemy contacts, and testimony from local informants who'd been paid to provide false intelligence. Richard had been living well above his military pay grade for months, and when investigators followed the money trail, they found a pattern of systematic betrayal that had put dozens of operations at risk. The personal vendetta became clear when Elena discovered Richard's statements from his court-martial hearing. Rants about how I'd destroyed his life and ruined his future for the sake of dead soldiers who knew the risks when they signed up. He'd shown no remorse for the deaths he'd caused, no understanding of the brotherhood he'd violated, and no acceptance of responsibility for his actions. Instead, he'd focused his rage on me, the soldier who'd exposed his crimes and ensured he faced consequences. "I'll find David Peterson someday," one transcript quoted him as saying, "and I'll make him pay for destroying my career. He thinks he's some kind of hero, but I'll show him what real consequences look like." Elena's hands were shaking as she read those words, understanding finally that our 6 months of harassment had been the opening moves in a revenge plot. that had been 15 years in the making. Richard's response to my ultimatum was swift and predictably desperate. Within hours of the HOA meeting, he'd hired a lawyer who specialized in what he euphemistically called veteran advocacy, which seemed to mostly involve portraying former military personnel as unstable and dangerous. The lawyer, a sleazy character who looked like he'd learned his trade from television, began spreading rumors that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress and had threatened Richard with violence. He filed for a restraining order, claiming that my military background made me a danger to the community and suggested that my wife and I were the real problem in the neighborhood. It was a clever strategy, playing on people's fears about veterans with combat experience, but it had one fatal flaw. Richard had already shown the community exactly what kind of man he really was. The escalation to physical violence came on Saturday night, when Richard hired 6 men to resolve the situation permanently. I knew they were coming because I'd been monitoring Richard's communications since the HOA meeting, using equipment and techniques that weren't exactly legal but were definitely necessary. The men he'd hired weren't amateurs like Max and Jake had been. These were professionals with criminal records and experience in the kind of work that didn't get advertised in newspapers. They'd been instructed to make it look like a home invasion gone wrong, but to make sure that Elena and I didn't survive to tell our side of the story. Richard had finally decided that killing us was easier than facing the consequences of his past actions, which meant he'd crossed a line that transformed this from a neighborhood dispute into a war. I spent Saturday afternoon preparing our home for siege, using skills I'd learned in places where survival depended on preparation and attention to detail. Elena wanted to call the police, but I explained that by the time they arrived, it would be too late to matter. Instead, I walked her through our escape room, showed her how to access the safe room I'd constructed in our basement, and gave her a crash course in basic self-defense that I hoped she'd never need to use. "David," she said as I checked the batteries in our emergency communications equipment, "this is insane. We're talking about people trying to kill us in our own home." I stopped what I was doing and looked at her. This woman who'd married a quiet consultant and found herself in the middle of a war she'd never asked for. "Elena," I said, "I'm going to keep you safe. Whatever it takes, however far I have to go, you're going to survive this night." The attack came at 2 a.m, which showed that Richard's hired killers had done their homework about civilian sleep patterns, but hadn't considered that their target might not be a typical civilian. I'd been awake and watching for hours, monitoring their approach through thermal imaging equipment that Elena's architecture firm had never heard of. 6 men, armed with automatic weapons and moving with tactical precision, surrounded our house with the kind of coordination that spoke of military training. They cut our power, disabled our landline, and used signal jammers to block cell phone communications. Under normal circumstances, Elena and I would have been sitting ducks, trapped and helpless in our own home. But circumstances hadn't been normal since the day I'd first put on a Navy SEAL uniform. And these men were about to learn that some prey fights back. The battle was swift and decisive, fought with a combination of military tactics and improvised weapons that turned our suburban home into something from an action movie. I used the garden hose as a tripwire, the fire extinguisher as both concealment and a weapon, and the carefully maintained landscaping as cover, while I moved through shadows that I knew better than the men hunting me. The first attacker went down when he walked into the nearly invisible wire I'd strung between 2 trees, hitting the ground hard enough to break his collarbone and put him out of the fight. The second fell victim to a pressurized blast of chemical foam that left him blind and choking, while I disabled him with techniques that Elena definitely wasn't supposed to see. By the time the remaining 4 realized they were hunting a predator instead of prey, I'd already taken control of the battlefield and turned their own tactics against them. The fighting moved through our backyard and into the house itself, a running battle that destroyed most of our remaining furniture but left all 6 attackers unconscious or incapacitated within 20 minutes. I'd taken a knife wound to my shoulder during the final confrontation, nothing life-threatening, but enough to remind me that I wasn't 25 anymore and couldn't absorb damage the way I used to. Elena emerged from the safe room to find me binding my wound with a kitchen towel, standing over 6 unconscious men who'd been secured with zip ties from my workshop. "David," she said, her voice steady despite everything she'd witnessed, "who were you before you became my husband?" I looked at her, this incredible woman who just lived through a situation that would have broken most people, and realized that she deserved the complete truth. While we waited for the police to arrive, Elena took charge of documenting everything, photographing the weapons the attackers had brought, recording their license plate numbers, and collecting evidence that would ensure Richard faced federal charges for conspiracy and attempted murder. She moved with a competence that impressed me, and I realized that our 6 months of harassment had transformed her from a victim into someone who understood how to fight back effectively. "Elena," I said as we heard sirens approaching, "when this is all over, when Richard is in prison where he belongs, there are things about my past that you need to know. Things I should have told you years ago." She looked at me with eyes that held no fear, only determination, and said something that made me fall in love with her all over again. "David, I don't care what you used to do or who you used to be. I care about who you are now, and right now, you're the man who saved our lives." With Richard's final desperate gambit exposed and David wounded, will the community finally see the truth, or will Richard's lies about David being dangerous actually work? This is getting intense. Who do you think the neighbors will believe, the respectable HOA president or the mysterious military guy? Drop your predictions below. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courts. It comes from truth being exposed in front of your community. The aftermath of Richard Harrison's attempted murder plot would expose him completely and transform our neighborhood in ways that none of us could have predicted. But more importantly, it would give Elena and me the chance to build something better than what we'd lost, and show our community what real leadership looked like. The final confrontation between Richard and justice was about to play out in the most satisfying way possible, with consequences that would echo through Willowbrook for years to come. The police investigation moved faster than I'd expected, largely because the evidence Elena and I had collected was overwhelming, and the federal charges Richard faced carried serious prison time. The 6 men Richard had hired were career criminals with rap sheets that read like a guide to violent crime, and when faced with potential life sentences, they were eager to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Their testimony painted a clear picture of Richard as the mastermind behind a conspiracy that included harassment, assault, destruction of property, and ultimately attempted murder. The lead detective, a sharp woman who'd obviously dealt with military cases before, told me that Richard's case was one of the most clear-cut examples of criminal conspiracy she'd seen in 20 years of police work. The community meeting that followed was unlike anything Willowbrook had ever experienced. Nearly every resident attended, drawn by rumors and news reports about the federal investigation that had turned their quiet neighborhood into the center of a criminal case that involved everything from HOA corruption to international terrorism connections from Richard's military past. Elena had organized the meeting with help from several neighbors who'd grown tired of Richard's leadership style, and the community center was packed beyond its normal capacity. When Elena stood up to address the crowd, she carried herself with a confidence that made me proud, and an authority that commanded immediate attention. "We're here tonight," she said, "because our community was deceived by a man who used his position of trust to settle personal vendettas and endanger innocent people." The most powerful moment came when our elderly neighbor, the kind man who'd first mentioned Richard's comments about settling scores, stood up to speak about what he'd witnessed over the past 6 months. His testimony carried weight because he'd lived in Willowbrook longer than almost anyone else, and had no personal stake in the conflict between Richard and us. "I'd watched this neighborhood for 30 years, he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "and I've never seen the kind of harassment and intimidation that Richard Harrison brought to our community. What happened to David and Elena Peterson could have happened to any of us who crossed him." Other residents followed with their own stories of harassment, unreasonable fines, and intimidation tactics that painted a picture of systematic abuse of power that had been building for months. The turning point came when Carol Jenkins, Richard's former assistant, took the microphone with tears streaming down her face. The woman who'd filmed Elena's assault and participated in months of harassment had clearly been doing some serious thinking about her choices and their consequences. "I need to apologize to everyone here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I let Richard convince me that what we were doing was for the good of the community, but I was wrong. We weren't protecting anyone. We were terrorizing good people because Richard wanted revenge for something that happened years ago." Her testimony about Richard's real motivations and his admission that he'd recognized David from day one was devastating, and I could see the crowd's mood shift from confusion to anger as they realized how completely they'd been manipulated. Richard's attempt to defend himself was pathetic and desperate, the flailing of a man who'd finally run out of lies and manipulation. He tried to portray himself as the victim, claiming that I'd threatened him and that his actions were justified self-defense against a dangerous veteran with psychological problems. But his credibility had been destroyed by the mountain of evidence against him, and his attempts to play the victim fell flat in front of people who'd seen the video of Elena's assault and heard testimony from his own hired criminals. When he tried to claim that his military service gave him the right to judge my fitness for civilian life, The crowd's reaction was swift and brutal. Someone shouted, "Traitor," from the back of the room, and the sentiment spread until Richard was forced to sit down under a barrage of anger that made it clear his time as a community leader was over. Elena's election as the new HOA president was unanimous, a result that surprised her, but didn't surprise me at all. She'd shown leadership during our crisis that was both natural and effective, and the community recognized that she understood the difference between authority and authoritarianism. Her first act as president was to propose a complete restructuring of HOA operations, with transparent decision-making processes, term limits for board members, and clear guidelines for what constituted legitimate community concerns versus personal harassment. "We're going to build a community that protects everyone's rights," she announced. Not just the rights of whoever happens to be in charge. The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic, the sound of people who finally felt like they had a voice in their own neighborhood. The legal resolution came swiftly and comprehensively, with Richard facing federal charges that would put him in prison for at least 15 years and possibly much longer. The conspiracy charges alone carried a potential life sentence, and when combined with his history of military betrayal, prosecutors felt confident that he would never again be in a position to harm innocent people. His assets were frozen to pay for restitution to everyone he'd harassed, including Elena and me, and the amount was substantial enough to cover not just our property damage, but also compensation for emotional trauma and legal expenses. More importantly, his conviction sent a message that abuse of power would have consequences, no matter how small the scale or how local the authority. Our house was rebuilt better than before, with Elena's architectural skills and my security expertise combining to create something that was both beautiful and impossible to assault. The new garden was even more spectacular than the original, featuring plants that Elena had chosen specifically for their symbolic meaning: resilience, growth, and renewal. The neighborhood itself transformed under Elena's leadership, becoming the kind of community that people actually wanted to live in, rather than simply tolerate. Property values increased, neighbor relationships improved, and the monthly community meetings became social events that people looked forward to rather than dreaded. Carol Jenkins, as part of her community service requirements, became one of Elena's most effective assistants in organizing neighborhood improvements. Standing in our rebuilt garden on a warm evening 6 months after Richard's conviction, I reflected on how much our lives had changed and how much we'd both grown from the experience. Elena had discovered leadership abilities she'd never known she possessed, and I'd learned that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost. When she asked me if I missed the excitement of my old life, I realized that the answer was complicated, but ultimately clear. I miss the brotherhood, I told her, and I miss feeling like my skills had a purpose. But I wouldn't trade this life, this community, and this woman for anything. She smiled and handed me a cup of coffee, and we stood together, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that had become truly peaceful for the first time in months. Looking directly into the camera that would share our story with the world, I wanted to leave people with something more than just entertainment. "Here's what I learned from all this," I said, settling into the chair that had become my favorite spot in our rebuilt garden. "Never underestimate the quiet neighbor who just wants to tend his garden in peace. Never assume that someone's peaceful exterior means they can't defend themselves when necessary. And definitely never attack a retired Navy SEAL's wife, because we might look harmless, but when you threaten our families, well, let's just say that the vulture knows how to hunt." Elena walked past carrying fresh flowers from our garden, and when she heard what I was saying, she laughed in a way that made everything we'd been through worthwhile. "Still telling war stories?" she asked. "Just sharing some life lessons, honey," I replied. "Just life lessons." The truth is that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes they're living right next door, disguised as ordinary people living ordinary lives. Richard Harrison thought he was targeting a soft suburban couple who would fold under pressure and disappear quietly into the night. Instead, he discovered that some prey fights back, that some quiet neighbors have extraordinary skills, and that justice has a way of finding people who think they're above consequences. If there's one thing I want people to take away from our story, it's this: don't let bullies win through intimidation, don't assume that victims are helpless, and don't ever give up on the possibility that communities can be better than the worst people in them. What other secrets might quiet neighbors be hiding, and what happens when ordinary people are pushed too far? This story proves that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. If this epic tale of justice served got your adrenaline pumping, make sure you're subscribed to Stories for more unbelievable true accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What's your take? Was David's response justified or did he go too far? Let me know in the comments below.